Coming up, the worst case worry warts of the year continues as we take a look at another scenario for the Brooklyn Nets that could bring concern. And that is, of course, the trade market, making sure that Sean Marks is ready to roll should things go off the rails. We dive in on Royce O'Neale, Dorian Finney-Smith, and even Cam Thomas coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie. He's the owner-operator of DFSR for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast and your New Jersey Devils on the Devils Puck Luck podcast. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And Doug, let the bad times keep on rolling here as we go ahead and give a dangerously pessimistic dose to the fan base this week. Today, talking about trades and what could be a really critical part if this season does not go about as well as it could. Nets making the playoffs, right? Being productive, everybody healthy. Will Sean Marks be ready to execute first and foremost on Royce O'Neale?
Yeah, look, worst case week continues here. We already talked about Mikal Bridges and what that could look like. We talked a lot about Ben Simmons and what that could look like. And now we talk about just a macro vision of the team and what this season could really hold for what the future holds for the team. And sort of the things that we probably need to see happen from Sean Marks and company at some point this season prior to the trade deadline that would signal, to me at least, I think, or to us, a clear understanding of what this team's future really is, right? Like what their team's present actually is and what the team's future really is. And there's some key guys on the team right now that frankly just need to be traded before the trade deadline. Like I don't really know another way to put it. And just to be blunt about it, because these guys represent like something that the Nets really don't need in this current iteration, and other teams out there in the NBA probably do need. And the hope here is that the Marks and company sort of understand that.
Before we dive down actually into Royce O'Neale, who's been discussed at length, even going back to the past trade deadline as well. You mentioned there at a macro level. Let's just hit a couple of key names here because Royce O'Neale is one of them. We know expiring $9.5 million. Spencer Dinwiddie, frankly, if we're being honest, right, about the potential expiring $20 million contract, you have to look at him, though. We've heard at least a low-level rumor the Nets want to keep him around. When we acknowledged last week that he is 30, like he is on the older side of this team, I think he falls in that category too. Then you get to a Dorian Finney-Smith who has a team-friendly contract, but is also on the older side here, going to be 30 during the course of this season. Is there anybody else from a veteran standpoint that you would add into that group of names that says, hey, you should be a part of it? Because on the other side, I have another one to add to Cam Thomas in terms of young players that I think are going to at least need to be discussed or thought about in a critical way by Sean Marks.
Yeah, look, if the idea here is to reset around youth, at least some, those are the names to consider that moving away from. Dinwiddie in a contract year, right? He's making 20.3 this season. He's going to be entering his age 31 season as a free agent, right? So and we've already seen him be able to be a contributor on a good team, right? Like that Mavs team 2 years ago, not last year, but 2 years ago was, played Golden State, right? They lost in that series, but Dinwiddie was closing games during that time. So Dinwiddie in a contract year, Dorian Finney-Smith, same, not in a contract year, but with a really advantageous contract. So that's where you like that. And Royce O'Neale, who makes no money, and also entering a contract year, even though he's 30. Like those guys, they all happen to be 30 years old right now. They all have different levels of value depending on the length of the contract or just the expiring contract piece of it. And I just don't see worlds where any three of those guys is part of the future for the team. And that's just sort of where the Nets are with this right now. We think that there's been in the past some misses on moving off of value at other trade deadlines, i.e. last year. And so that's why this becomes a concern, right? Is that like, how do the Nets view these guys in terms of long-term viable options? it's really hard to imagine they're part of a youth, a resetting youth movement, like in terms of re-signing new contracts, but the organization might have different views on this. And this is where I'm a little worried. Like, this is where the worst case scenario kind of comes in, because we've already seen Marks not be able to move off these guys or guys like this in the past when it seemed like the situation was ripe to do it. And now there's 3 dudes that, like, you can make very strong cases should not be on the team next year. But unless you have a different view of what the team is going to be next year, and I think that maybe you and I are in the reset mode, and maybe some other people aren't.
Well, and that's what's interesting about it too, because when you go back, remember, you can use the example of Joe Harris, right? You finally move off of him a year late or a half season late, but it also cost you draft capital to do so. None of these guys probably fall into that category, at least in this
Seth Curry.
moment. But
Curry,
Curry is the Curry was the thing that got Doug about as fired up as he's ever been on the podcast, on this idea of how do you keep this older player that has value to some roster somewhere else beyond the trade deadline last year, right? That was clearly a hot button for you, but you just mentioned it there. What is the intention here? Because you could make the case that even though you have Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson, and you want to be competitive, maybe all 3 of these guys shouldn't be on the team right now. Right. And through our eyes, we can make the case that at the draft, where was the best value? Could you have moved up? Right. We talked about those scenarios so much. If Sean Marks was, you can understand the logic of saying, I'm going to set a really high bar, and then we're going to move forward with these veteran players because of what it means in the short term. But to your point, if he didn't do it then there is a world where internally they're saying, for the life of Mikal Bridges' contract as it's currently constructed, we like having Royce O'Neale. Maybe we'll bring him back. We're going to keep Dorian Finney-Smith because the money is right, and we have some other things tied up in a Ben Simmons contract, right? Like Spencer Dinwiddie extension. If all 3 of these players, or even 2 out of the 3 of these players, are on this roster next year, you and I would be, I think, another level of frustrated potentially, because you're just trying to run 2 tracks and not necessarily maximizing the value when it matters most.
Yeah, and that's the problem. It's the 2-track sort of thing that we see happening here, these parallel ideas that are happening within the team. I get that some of it is like out of their control at this point, because not owning your draft picks for next year means that you can't enter a true rebuild. Like the team would probably love, I'm sure, like behind closed doors with a little bit of truth serum and not that much, the Nets would love to just have even one of their picks from Houston back, because this would make the situation so much easier. Like we wouldn't even be discussing most of this. They'd be in full on rebuild mode. Like they would go the OKC, Houston Rockets. I mean, Hornets never did it right, but Hornets, like some of these other teams that have gone in fully into the tank, even like the Blazers, who like tried and then tanked, right? And got scooped because of it. And Shaedon Sharpe too, because they got into the lottery the year before. Like any one of those situations would be the situation the Nets would love to place themselves in. I'm positive, but because they can't, they're sort of, I think, in this, got a mix of veteran, nice role player-ish veteran guys and some young guys, and let's kind of try to win, but that's going to be kind of tough. And I'm worried that track basically influences what happens with these guys that we just mentioned, which is to say they keep them around because they're veteran presence and they're good with the fans, and the fans, like, those would be all the wrong reasons, but I can see why they could get themselves into that mode.
Yeah, getting clouded by the fact that, wow, look at all the good vibes that this team has around it, because the expectations are nowhere near where you start to have a real, sense of urgency and needing to accomplish something beyond just making the playoffs. In a second here, we're going to talk about who should be gone, why they should be gone, when they should be gone relative to the season, and how it could actually help in that rebuilding process as soon as next year's draft class.
All right, before we get to that, I'm going to tell you about our friends over at Ibotta. Look, you're ending the summer here. You're maybe looking for some back-to-school savings. The summer's winding down. Maybe you're thinking about a fall trip. You want to be looking for ways that you can save some money to get some cash back on hundreds of grocery items that you're shopping for anyway. That is where Ibotta comes in. Ways to get that cash back to beat inflation. Really, with no matter what you're purchasing, all you got to do is get on the Ibotta app, and you just basically upload either your receipts from stuff you did, or you just link accounts of places you're already shopping, and Ibotta is going to give you cash back for the purchases. The average Ibotta user earns, wait for this number, $120 per year. That's just for using the app. It can cover the cost of an entire shopping trip just on its own. Super easy to get started with Ibotta, and the benefits are just so clearly there. Some other apps are giving you points. Those points just really never amount to much. With Ibotta, you get real cash back. You can cash out from your bank account. I was just actually talking with my sister this past weekend, mentioning Ibotta, just because she loves to find deals. And she actually went crazy about Ibotta. I should actually put her on the phone, had her do the read, because as we were taking a walk, she did a full Ibotta read. And that was just during our conversation about the app. You can start feeling the same way about Ibotta. Right now, Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 just for trying Ibotta by using the code LOCKED, just like our podcast network. Whenever you register, just go to the App Store or Google Play, download the free Ibotta app, and use code LOCKED. That's Ibotta, IBOTTA, in the Google Play or App Store, and use the code LOCKED.
All right, continuing our worst case scenario week here on Locked On Nets. And by the way, shout out to all the fans over on YouTube, because when you talk about being mostly a positive podcast and loving the interaction with the fans, boy, did they come after us on these first couple of them. The Mikal Bridges scenario, the Ben Simmons, and the Ben Simmons one was good, which we knew it was going to be, where it was the one side of it was, why are you doing this? We need to be positive. We can't go into the season with these negative thoughts. That was a great one. And then the flip side was, you guys are suckers anyway, because Ben Simmons is what he is. He's never going to be anything. So the worst case is the obvious case. It was fantastic. I loved every single comment that people were bringing.
I got to tell you real quick, I don't want to derail this podcast. I just want to say one thing about the Simmons thing. There is no more irrational talk around anything in the NBA than there is around Ben Simmons on both sides. Because everyone falls into one of two things. He is either coming back as 2019 Ben Simmons, and the Nets have the best value in the league. And if you don't think so, you're crazy. That's the one side. The other Ben Simmons one is, you might as well just, like, he's already 6 feet in the grave, and now we're just pouring dirt on top of him. No one exists in the middle, which I think our podcast was. Like no one exists in the middle in this debate. You can't even put it out there. If you put his name out there, you are going to get one of those two camps ringing in, and they're so resolute in it. Anyway, so we can go on with this thing. But the Simmons rhetoric on both sides is absolutely unbelievable to watch play out.
Loved every moment of it, 100%. So as we talk about where the worst case scenarios of trade possibilities for the Brooklyn Nets, a big reason for me, let's just stick here and close out the reason why I think when you look at a Royce O'Neale, a Dorian Finney-Smith, and even Spencer Dinwiddie to a slightly lesser extent, because we've talked about him specifically and the need for players like this inside the roster. But remember, with all the moves that the Nets made this offseason, which includes bringing in Dennis Smith Jr., Lonnie Walker, and then even for me, a big one is Jalen Wilson, and getting him in the draft, seeing how he performed in Summer League, and knowing where his age is, because you want to get him into the fold here as quickly as possible, I think. So when you go look at the depth chart, if you keep Royce O'Neale and you keep Dorian Finney-Smith, well, when are you getting to the point when you see a Jalen Wilson in the second half of the season potentially, so you understand what you have in him? Because you got to confirm that sooner than later. We love Summer League. Now confirm it at the NBA level. Likewise, if you think that you stole some value with Dennis Smith Jr. or Lonnie Walker in this offseason on these short-term deals, well, you want to go ahead and find out. Are we going to re-up and invest in these players? And if you keep creating log jams ahead of them for players that we don't think have a long-term future, when are you going to do the evaluation? I know that this has been a running theme for us when we talk about the front office at times. If you run two tracks, what you find out is you get no closer necessarily to either destination, right? Yep. All you end up is getting, we did a lot of circles, right? Turned off Google Maps and just kind of roamed through the streets for a while. And that's my biggest concern when you kind of do have mid-20s guys and rookies that you need to get good looks at and could be ready to contribute right now.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's actually the point, right? It's that, like, not only do these guys represent maybe not future pieces of the puzzle when it comes to the team, but if they're also natural blockers to building up the guys you kind of need for the future, then you are operating on this weird double bottom line that ends up being negative on both sides, on both sides of it, right? Or both sides of the ledger. And that would be also really, really unfortunate to have it end up being the case, because look, I like Royce O'Neale and I like Dorian Finney-Smith. I love Royce O'Neale, actually. Like, he's been one of the really, truly kind of most important guys for the Nets over the last couple seasons. Last season, he was sort of everything they needed and more when they traded for him. Now, it didn't work out for the reason they did did end up trading for him, but they got, I would say, kind of like almost max value out of him and what they asked him to do. It's really nothing about those guys. The thing with him and Dorian Finney-Smith and Spencer Dinwiddie, frankly, Dinwiddie's a little different because they actually don't have a lot of other guys like this on the roster, so they sort of need his skill set just to sort of be a team.
Yeah.
The other guys, we just know what they are. There's nothing new coming from any of these dudes, right? Mm-hmm. That's fine. That what they do and what we know about them already has value in the current NBA. Clearly, no doubt. It's just that the Nets aren't going to derive the true value out of these guys for what we already know they are. Mm-hmm. And if we already know that, and there's really nothing else to learn, go have another team derive full value in it. And let's see what else like you said, really pretty perfectly at the beginning there, is that let's go see what else the Nets do have, because that is the future. These guys are not the future. They're not the future of the team. The other guys that you mentioned, the young guys, are going to be the future of the team. We can't have a situation where they don't get value for DFS and Royce and to some degree Spencer, and also block developmental patterns for the other guys below them. It'd be literally like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like it just wouldn't make robbing Peter to pay Paul. And I can just use a bunch of other anachronisms here, like to figure this out, but like go all day with these. Like you just aren't getting anything either way if that's what you choose to do.
Yeah, one in the hands, worth two in the bush. We all get it, right? This is where does the value lie? No, and that's also, on top of which the developmental piece. So the other side of it, specifically when we talk about these veterans, because in segment number 3, I'm going to list a handful of young guys that need to be looked at seriously over the course of this season as well, that are maybe the in-between of, are they developmental track? Are they the future? Is if you think that a big part of this is not having your own draft capital next year, which the Nets can't get back unless they somehow facilitate an insane trade with the Houston Rockets. But even just getting first-round picks in next year's draft matter. And you can say, as of right now, it's not a really strong draft class. That's always very fluid over the course of a college season. But even beyond that, just having the picks means that you can strengthen 2025. You can strengthen 2026, right? Because you can always move those assets. The things you can't move are the assets that you don't have, right? And the things that you can't get value for are the assets that are depreciating in value. And no matter what, they're always going to be, when it comes to these guys, I think every second after the trade deadline this year, especially with a guy like Royce O'Neale on an expiring contract. You said it right about Spencer Dinwiddie. I think that one's a little bit trickier. But with Royce O'Neale, he's walking away. And maybe the worst of the worst case scenario is that the Nets turn around and say, we're going to bring you back. We're thinking about bringing you back, on a 2 or 3 year deal. And this again goes back to the top around Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson and this iteration of the team where Sean Marks is saying, we want to stay competitive over these contracts and see where things go. You can paint the picture of being a very low level back end, making the playoff roster with Royce O'Neale and with Dorian Finney-Smith for multiple more seasons. But it would be short-sighted in not only what you can accomplish, also that, as we just mentioned there, guys like, I didn't even say these guys. This is minutes from a minute standpoint. Watford, right? Baisley. We've done the 240 time and time again on this podcast. When you break down the minutes, at some point, there just isn't enough room to be able to play these guys. So you pick up guys that you and I break down and say, yeah, it's worth the flyer. He has this skill set. Maybe it could be X. We highlighted the defensive insane versatility of some of these collections of players for the Nets. And then they don't play. So then you don't know. So then they walk and they sign somewhere else, right? Like that is the critical point here. It's only awesome that you pick up and take looks at young guys if you actually find out if they have value. And that is the concern for me with Sean Marks, is that he's never fully pot committed. And by the way, he's never fully on the hot seat either when it comes to the organization, because he seems to have a very secure job if you made it through that era. Let's get into the young players here in a second, especially one Cam Thomas. And yes, I'm even going to make a mention of one Nicholas Claxton this season as well, coming up next. Okay, so the worst case scenario, worst week of worries that we've ever had in the world for the Brooklyn Nets continues here, talking about trades. Let's get into the young guys, Doug. Cam Thomas, first and foremost. The worry here is that they don't play him. The worry here, now they have control of him going to next year. They can pick up that option at a very reasonable price. But again, this is a guy that you need to be either showcasing him and trading him, playing him and giving him a role. And these veterans and the track that you're on keep creating some weird version of a logjam where he just does not come to fruition solely based on organizational thinking.
Yeah, look, like he's one of them, and he's clearly the guy that we talked about a lot. Like they can't. Fortunately, these other guys don't really sort of naturally block him as much as some of the other guys.
Yes.
But again, with 240 minutes to play with, and like lots of wing-ish guys, like there are only so many ways to go here. So he's part of it. But if you just look at the ages of all the other guys you mentioned, like let me just run through these ages because you mentioned a bunch of dudes, and just so we're clear about what these guys are. Cam's 21, Darius Baisley 23. Lonnie Walker, 24. Trent Watford, 22. Jalen Wilson, I know he's a rookie, 22. Like these guys are all 7+ years younger than the other guys that we mentioned at the top of this. Seven's the minimum. So for some of them, it's 8-9 years. Like they're so much younger. I mean, and these guys are probably pretty far away here, but like Clowney's 19, Tariq Whitehead's 19. I know those guys kind of fit into a different context, but just because we're probably not going to see too much of either this season, I don't think. But those other guys are like 7 years minimum, sometimes 8 or 9 years younger than Spencer, then Dorian Finney-Smith, then Royce O'Neale. That's like, it's a generation younger. Like they can't be blocked. When I say before that we know what the other guys are, you just can't block young guys like this. And I know some of these are sort of post types, flyers like, Darius Baisley, or just sort of total flyers like Watford. I get it, but the Nets have to be in the flyer mode here. We like those signings for those reasons. And they being in that mode means moving out of the other mode. And Cam too. I mean, we did whole episodes about Cam Thomas at this point. Like we're firm on where this needs to go with him. Like none of these guys can block him at all at this point, unless you just know it's over and you don't want to do it. I actually don't think the way Cam has come out in this offseason and been sort of doing some media rounds and been much more forward facing with like just the public and the media. I actually think I have a feeling that there has been some internal talk that like his role is going to expand this year. I just think it lines up with the sort of his overall general attitude toward things. Like I did a whole solo episode about like the pretty positive stuff that he's been talking about. I think that only comes with like sort of maybe some internal promises around like what his role is going to be. So I'm not too worried about it, but yeah, in general, like it's nuts. Like 8 or 9 years, when you hear that number, like it makes it even crazier to think that these other guys play, right?
Oh, no, it genuinely does. And you mentioned with Cam Thomas there too, it's like, this is your time now is the internal message, right? We had superstars. We had a different track. You're young. You're a scorer. Like this can be your moment to push yourself into a position here with this team. And to your point, even in the backcourt, different roles, different, prescribed values for these guys. But Dennis Smith Jr. shouldn't stand in his way. Lonnie Walker shouldn't stand in his way, right? So there's a reason why Cam Thomas should be thought about in that particular vein. And oh, by the way, like I'll add this in here before I do we'll close out probably on the Nicholas Claxton point, which I think is scary, but also really important to have. Like a guy like Lonnie Walker is a good example of the other side of this. Young player took a flyer on him. What if he shoots pretty well and the season is going okay and he's not playing big minutes? You can trade him. Like that's a big part of taking flyers on young guys that have played on teams that have had superstars and have been in the playoffs. There are other flippable, even young assets that are more appealing to teams around the NBA than even say, a rookie that hasn't played like Jalen Wilson. Well, no team's coming knocking down your door at the trade deadline for him, but Lonnie Walker, who's a perimeter shooter and has played with the Lakers, like, yeah, you can squint and see where a playoff team is going to want to add somebody like that to come off of their bench where you're running him for 15 minutes for the Nets. All of these things have to be balanced for the Nets if you're going to be successful. My other big concern then here, if we're going to get real worried, is around Nicholas Claxton, because we just did go listen to the Ben Simmons episode. Obviously, the big theme of that was the contract and having that money tied up there. The Spencer Dinwiddie money and Royce O'Neale money, you can combine that and get almost $30 million and say, hey, there you go. We can pay for Nicholas Claxton. But you need to have a clear sense of what your intention is going forward. And that includes Ben Simmons. It includes, by the way, everybody else inside of that group. Day'Ron Sharpe. You mentioned Noah Clowney. I don't think we're going to see him this year, but you're going to build him in the background. What is his role going to look like? What is the front court intention for this team? Because seeing how Ben Simmons and Nicholas Claxton play together, seeing how Nicholas Claxton and anybody else play together is going to matter. And you know what's not going to matter? Is playing Nicholas Claxton with Dorian Finney-Smith, is playing Nicholas Claxton with Royce O'Neale. You need to see how Nicholas Claxton can match up having Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson as your focal points, and then other young players that Nicholas Claxton needs to be better than, right? He needs to be a leader of a lot of these other guys. There is a world that I'm not a fan of, but where if the Nets aren't planning on giving Nicholas Claxton a $25+ million a year contract, you have to look at that as well. So like, this is as dark as a road as you could go on trade scenarios, but you better confirm that Nicholas Claxton has the exact role that you want from him going forward. Otherwise, peak value is before you give him the big contract, not after.
Yeah, there just has to be an understanding of that, right? Like there's no excuse for this at this point. Like there's too many scenarios here that we've laid out with basically every guy that isn't these other guys, and how they affect the overall strategy and path. Claxton's another perfect example. Frankly, everyone on the roster except for these three guys is the example. like we basically have listed except for Bridges and Cam Johnson, and those ones are just so obvious, that they don't, and they're not getting blocked either. But like with Claxton, it's the same thing as all these other guys. And so freeing up assets to make sure you retain them, like making sure that you get a full max sort of like understanding of what he can be for the team going forward. Because again, like when you look at his age, it's right in the say he's 24, right? It's all, we basically listed everyone 24 and under on the team as needing to make sure that like the sort of the future is solidified. Guess what? That's like everybody in the team. The Nets are super young now. Like it's underrated. The Nets, they don't have any really high and top 20 superstar in the league guys. Let's put Bridges like top 40, probably somewhere in there. And I'm sure we'll get comments about that number, but whatever. But like after that, like the Nets are just super, super young. Like they have to now lean into the youth. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's just, we listed every dude on the roster. Like it's every guy besides these three guys. It's nuts.
And by the way, if you think about it, like I mentioned Nicholas Claxton there, okay, he could be a $25 million a year player next off season, but you have a year of control on Cam Thomas, but you're going to pay him. He's going to get a contract, 2 years from now, right? If you think Dennis Smith Jr. can be a part of this team going forward beyond this year, whatever that number is, he's going to be a part of it, right? So all of these add up to, when you start crunching the numbers, like it seems like you're only a year or two away from clearing a lot of money off the books. You're also a year or two away from spending a lot of money, right? And needing to allocate money for some of the young talent that you want to keep there, along with Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson. So maybe what this really ended up coming down to was it's the worst case scenario. It's all around the trust for Sean Marks, who has hit some highs and also had some weird and concerning lows. That's going to be the guy that we watch here as we see things unfold on the court. Should make for a fun season ahead. As a reminder, guys, this is the worst case week. We get out of here, we're okay, right? We get out of this week. We go right back to our normal scheduled programming.
No, it's worst case, but it's also like realistic case too. I want to call it both things at the same time, right? Because it's doing both things. It's like these are the worst case scenarios, but you have to think about these in terms of the team, but it's also just trying to be realistic about the team as well. Okay, we're gonna get out of here. Much appreciated all those aforementioned YouTube comments. We just love it, even if you disagree. Like just ring it in with some disagreement. Those are as fun as the agreements sometimes. That's what makes talking sports and specifically the Nets a really good time. Why we love doing it every single day. To do that, you also got to make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. We are right at the tipping point into 6,000 subscribers. It's ridiculous that we've gone another week with mentioning this, but we should just be there by now. Get us through the week. Subscribe to Locked On Nets over on YouTube. Leave a comment as well.
It is imperative that we continue to build chemistry as a team and remain true to our long-established values of togetherness and sacrifice. Well, that's right. It's Shawnee Marks, GM for the Nets.
One of the all-time great poets. We're back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball.